It's more accurate. More accurate than the ancient Rolex, I guess. So, all right.
Okay, well, everybody, thank you very much for joining us. My name is Peter Havens, and I'm the chairman of Baldwin Management. And courtesy of our family office, we look forward to a very interesting and timely discussion today about China and Taiwan with our guest Ambassador Raymond Burghardt. But before that starts, I'm going to ask my associate, Christina McCloy, to give us all the rules of the road so you understand how to ask a question when you want to ask a question. And then I'm going to turn it, then Chrissy will hand it off to my partner, Richard May, who will introduce Ambassador Burghardt. So Chrissy?
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Christina. Just kind of share my screen here real quickly. And for those of you who are looking in, can follow along. So we're just going to go over a couple of rules while we're doing the presentation. Let's just see here. While the presentation is happening, we're going to ask everyone to keep yourselves on mute. This will just deter any distracting background noise that could distract or inhibit the presentation or the audience from hearing what is presented. During the Q&A session, we ask that everyone continue to stay muted. Use the raise your hand feature to add yourselves to the queue to voice your question. When selected, you will unmute yourself, ask your question. Once your question is answered, then I will put you on mute again. And I'm just going to share here how we access that raise your hand feature. If you're joining via video and you're looking at your Zoom screen here, there is a button right here in this menu under reactions, and then there is an option that says raise your hand. You just click that button, it will put you in the queue. I will see that your hand is raised and I'll call you in the order in which your questions come up. And then to lower your hand, you do the same thing. You just click on that reactions button, you click on lower hand, and it takes you out of the queue. Beyond that, if you're joining us by phone and you have a question, you can dial *9 on your phone to be added to the queue. That will put your name on the list for me. I will unmute you, instruct you to ask your question, and then once you're finished, you can dial *9 again and lower your hand. I will go back over that once again right before we get into the Q&A section of the presentation, but that is just the overview for now. I'm going to turn it over to Richard May to do the introduction of our guest speaker. And let me just unshare my screen. There we go.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Peter. And special thanks to Raymond Burghardt for being our guest speaker today. My family has known Raymond and his family for actually close to 45 years. We met when our kids were in Weano Play Lake School back in the day, and they were at the time 3 or 4 years old. They're now in their mid to late 40s. So we've known Ray and his family for many, many years. Ray used to live in the Washington, D.C. area before he started spending a lot of his time in Asia. I won't name the many places that he served, but he served this country with great distinction in many positions. And the culmination of those was serving as our ambassador to Vietnam, succeeding Pete Peterson, well-known first ambassador to Vietnam. And then Ray subsequently went on to be the chairman of the American Institute in Taiwan, which has been described as the de facto embassy of the United States of America in Taiwan. So without further ado, Ray is going to speak today about Taiwan, which has been in the news a lot recently. So I'm anxious to hear his prepared remarks and anxious to pepper him with questions as soon as he's done. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. I'm speaking from my home in Honolulu. I also still have a home in Cape Cod, but this time of year, I spend most of my time here when I'm not traveling to Asia, which has started up again. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, and good afternoon to all of you. Great pleasure to be with you and to talk about the issue of Taiwan. It is, of course, very current. It was the major topic of the meeting that President Biden and General Secretary Xi Jinping had in Bali, Indonesia, just a couple of days ago. I'm up to date on that. I had dinner here in Honolulu last night with Taiwan's de facto ambassador here in the United States. I'm going to structure my remarks. Probably they're going to be a little longer than I had thought, but it is a complicated subject. First, let's define the issue. What is the status of Taiwan? What is Beijing's view of that? What is our view of that? What's the Taiwanese view of that? Second, what is China likely to do and when? And what is its capability and what do we think its intent is? And then how is Taiwan going to respond? How capably? How is the US going to respond? And then increasingly important and likely, what about our allies, particularly Japan? And then I think the last subject is how do we prevent all that happening? How do we reduce the likelihood or at least keep putting it off forever? In other words, we have to talk about deterrence and defense capability if deterrence doesn't work. And also the assurances that to China that may actually be part of the process as well. First of all, defining the issue. The Communist Party in Beijing claims that Taiwan is part of China and that it must be reunified, as they say, with the Chinese mainland. And that means under their control, under the political control of China's current government. Taiwan's view is obviously different. The government in Taiwan maintains that it is a sovereign state, which is called the Republic of China, which has been in power since it took over mainland China in 1912. And the ROC government, that's Republic of China, I'm going to use that term, of course, they lost control of the mainland in 1949. And when the communists won the Civil War. And the government of Chiang Kai-shek, remember him, fled to Taiwan and set up their headquarters in Taiwan, moving it from Nanjing, which had been the capital of the Republic of China. And about 1 to 2 million people, extraordinary number of people, fled the mainland with Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan, which at the time only had about 8 million inhabitants. So the history of Taiwan's relationship to mainland China is a rather odd one, an unusual one. Originally, Taiwan was inhabited by Malay people, not ethnic Chinese. And they are still a minority population in Taiwan, about 300,000 or so. Chinese settlers, ethnic Chinese settlers, didn't start to arrive until the late 1600s and through the 1700s, coming from southern China, mainly Fujian province, which is right on the other side of the Taiwan Strait, which is about 95 miles wide, and also some from Guangdong province in southern China. The Chinese actually, apparently Xi Jinping lectured Biden during their meeting at great length about the history of Taiwan and its relationship to mainland China. But I imagine my history might be a little different than his. But from my understanding, and most people's understanding, the island was largely ignored by Beijing and by the Qing court there. They considered it kind of a wild place, and occasionally it was occupied for long periods of time by other countries, including Portugal and the Dutch. And they really, mainland China, Beijing, the Beijing court, the emperor and his people, they didn't pay a lot of attention to Taiwan until the 1880s. And then they finally made it a province, sent a very capable governor, and then all of that didn't last very long, maybe 10 years. And then in 1895, control over Taiwan was lost. And the Japanese took it over because the Chinese had lost the first Sino-Japanese war. So it became a Japanese colony until 1945. Interestingly, curiously, today in Taiwan, the memories of the Japanese rule are relatively positive. It's radically unlike the attitudes in mainland China or Korea, where there's sort of very bitter memories of Japanese domination. So in 1945, war ended. Chiang Kai-shek's government took control of Taiwan. So it was reunited with the mainland. How long? 4 years. That's it, 4 years, until the Civil War ended. And as I said, all of Chiang Kai-shek's forces came fleeing across the strait to Taiwan. Now, the US government continued to recognize the Republic of China government, then located in Taipei, as China, the only China. We did not have relations with mainland China and had very little contact until President Nixon's famous trip in February 1971, preceded by Kissinger's secret trip the July before. And then we opened up a little office in Beijing. I used to work out of there occasionally, coming from Hong Kong. Finally, President Carter recognized China, the mainland China. We dropped relations with the Republic of China on Taiwan and established them with Beijing on January 1st, 1979. But keeping things complicated, we continue to maintain ties with Taiwan, pretty good ties. Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act, and the Taiwan Relations Act set up a formula that in the end was copied by many other countries also, which was basically to continue to maintain relations with Taiwan while pretending we didn't. We set up something called the American Institute in Taiwan, AIT. That's the de facto embassy that Richard referred to. I headed that office in Taipei for 2 years, from 1999 to 2001. And then the AIT also has an office in Washington, and I headed that office for a long time, 10.5 years, from 2006 to 2016. So what was our position about Taiwan and about China? Well, our position, which is still our position, and this was all in all the communiques we signed with Beijing, we acknowledged their position, Beijing's position, that they considered Taiwan to be part of China. But we didn't take any position ourselves on the current status of Taiwan or what the eventual status would be. As I joked to Richard just before this, some of this gets to be very theological almost, Talmudic or Jesuitical, Our position is that we have no position, except was that the fate of Taiwan ultimately had to be resolved peacefully. And we had a defense alliance with Taiwan. We ended the defense treaty, since the Republic of China, which the treaty was with, no longer existed as far as we were concerned. But under the Taiwan Relations Act, and this is of course very important, we agreed to provide, we didn't just agree, we provided, we undertook to continue to provide Taiwan with the means to defend itself. Weapons, training, and we also said that in the event of any act of coercion or aggression against Taiwan, and it was specifically named some of the options like invasion or blockade or quarantine, that we would see that as the language used was a threat to the peace of the Western Pacific, which would require the president to confer with Congress about how to respond. That was put in there by Congress, which of course is always jealous of its right to declare war. That's why the language was specifically phrased in that way. And also very important, but often forgotten, the Taiwan Relations Act also explicitly requires the US to maintain the military capability to be able to respond to such an act of aggression or emergency. So in the 44 years since we broke diplomatic relations with the Republic of China on Taiwan, the island, I mean, at the time this agreement was signed, the people involved, like Zbig Brzezinski, who I knew well as a student at Columbia, or Dick Holbrook, then the Assistant Secretary for East Asia, whom I also knew very well. They didn't expect we'd still be talking about this in 2022. They figured this would all be resolved by then. China would somehow have taken over Taiwan. To be all, you know, this was something that was not going to be a really long-term issue. But it is. One reason is Taiwan went through an absolutely extraordinary period of remarkable economic and political development, becoming rich and becoming democratic. Personally, I've watched this over the years. My first trip to Taiwan was in 1970 on the way to Vietnam during the war. Spent a week there. Then I was there from 76 to 77 studying Chinese at the State Department school there. Then I was our representative there 99 to 01, and I've been back countless times since then. So I've seen this development from a pretty poor and very dictatorially run country under Chiang Kai-shek and his son, to a place which has become very impressive. Since 1987, it's developed into a very healthy democracy, one of the healthiest in Asia, maybe the healthiest. Free press, free assembly, free speech, peaceful rotation of political parties in power. The economic growth has been equally remarkable. Taiwan is now, as I think everyone knows, the world's semiconductor capital. The founder of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing is a close friend of mine. TSMC manufactures the most advanced chips in the world. It's a strong manufacturing and research hub right across the whole range of electronics and high-tech industries. So all these developments, this extraordinary growth, the democratization, the wealth of the place, a place of only 24 million people, has greatly strengthened the sympathy and even the affection in Taiwan in the United States, most notably in our Congress. And that's bipartisan, both Republicans and Democrats. In fact, many of us have observed over the years, Congress in many ways considers Taiwan kind of a ward of the Congress, if necessary to protect against possibly pusillanimous attitudes by the White House and the State Department. There's a huge congressional Taiwan caucus in the Congress with very powerful senators and congressmen on both sides of the aisle who are part of it. I should say one of the things that helps in that, you know, is that and very important and a big change that occurred, I would say, in our attitude during the Obama administration, when I was the chairman of American Institute in Taiwan. The economic growth meant that suddenly Taiwan was no longer just some kind of annoying issue in our China relationship. It meant that Taiwan was now a place that was important in its own right. It became extraordinarily, for its size, one of our largest trading partners, regularly somewhere between 8th and 10th largest trading partners. Not only do we import a lot from there, but we export a lot also. Also a very big investor in the United States. I have seen enormous multi-billion dollar investments in South Texas built by the Formosa Plastics Corporation, just as an example. And in Taiwan, the sense of pride in what they had accomplished against all odds, this extraordinary contrast between their open democratic political system and very, very healthy economy on their side versus the autocracy, the often madness of the political system in China, gave Taiwan a strong sense of pride. And what many Taiwanese, I would even say now most, would consider their country, as they would call it, to have a very separate identity. And part of that also comes from the history I described, in which the years of unity with the mainland were really very episodic and limited. So with that self-confidence, maybe somewhat paradoxically, also came a willingness and an openness to the idea of relations with the mainland of some kind. And a government came in power in Taiwan from 2008 to 2016, which very quickly started to break down some of the barriers between the two sides, opening up direct flights, now many times a day, direct shipping, trade agreements, serious trade agreements, which allowed a boom in exports between the two sides and a boom in investment, particularly by Taiwan in the mainland, which had actually already started before 2008. Today, 40% of Taiwan's exports go to the mainland, or I'm slipping a bit because they're trying to bring it down, but maybe at least 25%, I would say. This kind of warm relationship took a hit in 2016 with the election of a new government still in power, of representing a party that was not so enthusiastic about close relations with the mainland, more identified with the idea of declaring Taiwan independence, scrapping any reference to the Republic of China. That has brought on a lot of tension across the Taiwan Strait. It also means that they no longer are talking to each other in sort of official talks between the two sides. Interestingly, though, the trade, the flights, the shipping continues. There hasn't been any progress in sort of opening up new areas of engagement, but the old areas agreed on before 2016 continue. Okay, now let's switch to the PRC and China. You know, from the time of Mao on, China has maintained that it must reunify with Taiwan, and that is a sacred mission. The sense of urgency about it has changed over the years. Mao Zedong used to sometimes airily say, well, we can put that off for 100 years. Exact words. But Deng Xiaoping also seemed to think that, you know, we're worried about economic growth. We can put that off for a while. A couple of things have changed. Beijing is now much more powerful. It has systematically increased its military strength. It now has the largest navy in the world. It has very systematically developed the capability to try to keep us from coming to the rescue. What's known by our military friends, they have some acronym for it, area and access denial. That means that if we move our carriers in, they have missiles that can hit the carriers. And meanwhile, Xi Jinping, now in power already for 10 years, is somebody who very strongly argues that this is something that has to be accomplished. He hasn't set a precise deadline, but he talks about how he has publicly talked about how China is developing the capability to carry it out by its force, if necessary, and that will be achieved by 2027. On a somewhat longer term, he has talked about how China is now engaged in a process of national rejuvenation to achieve that by the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party's rule in China, which would be 2049. And that rejuvenation must include the complete reunification of China. All of this is contrasted in the way the Communist Party talks about their history with the previous 100 years, from the Opium Wars of the 1840s until unification under the Communist Party in 1949, which is viewed as 100 years of humiliation, where China was carved up by the Japanese, by all the Western controlled treaty ports and so forth. I think equally important, Xi Jinping, other leaders have made clear that while they talk somewhat vaguely about having capability by 2027, having 2049 as a year when it really must be happened by then, they also talk about their red lines. And if Taiwan or if the US crosses the red lines, they make clear, pretty clear, that they would have to react militarily if necessary at that point. Now, they always declare, quite clearly that, and repeat, a mantra to the effect that they want to achieve this peacefully. But they, as they see Taiwan drift away, sense of separate identity become more obvious there. I would say important to note that the idea of peaceful unification has become even more remote after the people in Taiwan have seen the way China dealt with Hong Kong. China declares that Taiwan would be unified under a system of one country, but two systems. Hong Kong showed that it's really one system. And no one in Taiwan believes the pledge of two systems, if anybody ever did before, and there weren't many, frankly. What are the red lines? I would say, okay, this was also a big subject of discussion between our two leaders in Bali a couple of days ago. And it came out, was mentioned quite clearly in Taiwan, and China's statement of, its statement about the meeting. The red lines would be any declaration by a Taiwan government that it is now the Republic of Taiwan, and the hell with trying to maintain that we're a rump government of China anymore. That seems, why would that matter that much? Well, it matters to them. That means that giving up on unification. So that would be a very definite red line. What would a U.S. crossing of a red line look like? Certainly, anything that looked like we were reestablishing our defense relationship with Taiwan, reestablishing the defense alliance, which technically expired 1 year after denormalization, January 1st, 1980. That would include, for example, stationing large numbers of troops on Taiwan. We actually do have small contingents of special forces that are there doing training at times. I can say that now since it's totally leaked out and everybody knows about it. But and of course, Beijing had a hissy fit over that. But I mean, actually putting, seriously putting forces there ready for combat would be crossing a red line. And I would say open U.S. support of Taiwan independence or restoring diplomatic ties would also be seen as crossing red lines. I would note parenthetically that those are both actions which certain well-known American political figures have advocated. So fortunately, we haven't done it yet. I don't think we will. So we all saw Beijing's response to Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Those of us who watch these things carefully, it was pretty obvious that big show could not have been put together overnight. That was a scenario they had sitting on the shelf, waiting for the right excuse to carry it out. And Nancy Pelosi provided them with the excuse. It was essentially practicing a blockade. And it was serious. I mean, it involved a number of firsts, including firing missiles over the island of Taiwan. They had never done that before. Firing missiles into the territorial waters of Japan, which they had not done before, which was a nasty message to the Japanese. And so it was a big deal. So we don't underestimate PLA capabilities, People Liberation Army capabilities. We don't question their ultimate intent, but I should say that it is the general assessment of both US intelligence and also that of non-governmental experts, both US and non-US, that China is still a bit short of the capability to carry out a successful amphibious landing and takeover of Taiwan. Most military people will tell you that's still the most difficult maneuver in warfare. And the Taiwan Strait is 4 times wider than the English Channel, and a bit rougher also. The Chinese still lack something. What we observe in their exercises, we know from our careful assessment of this, they carrying out that kind of amphibious operation, having the necessary equipment for it, the air cover for it, being able to have a really combined arms engagement in which all their forces work together, like a glove. They're not quite there yet, but maybe they will be by 2027, which is their stated goal. And we also would say that the prelude to an invasion would likely be a devastating missile and possibly air attack as well, and destroying infrastructure, destroying military capability on Taiwan and possibly of other countries. We wouldn't rule out possibly even US bases in Japan. And they could do that now if they wanted to, probably. It doesn't mean it would succeed. I mean, it might not succeed if we responded, but they could do it. So how would Taiwan respond? There's always a lot of speculation about the sort of resolution of people in Taiwan to respond. I'm more optimistic about that than maybe some people. And the polls have been pretty good on that lately. I think on many of these issues, Ukraine has been helpful in that way, in stealing the Taiwanese and reminding them that bad things can happen and that there are bad people in the world. The Taiwanese have done a lot in the last year or two to strengthen what the military call asymmetrical strength, which is what they need. Asymmetrical strength is what a smaller, weaker power can use against a stronger power in order to delay them and overcome them by using its own strengths, including the fact that they're a defender, including the fact that there's a strait there, and then using the appropriate kind of weapons. In this case, they are things like mobile anti-ship cruise missiles, sea mines, and the way to quickly lay them and quickly remove them. Missiles that shoot down missiles, like Patriots and other systems. All of these things they are stocking up on. We are helping them to stock up on it. They have their own domestic capability to produce, which is not bad. They're also producing these sort of fast attack speedboats, very much like the ones the Iranians use that drive us nuts in the Persian Gulf. And what about us? President Biden famously has 4 times said that we would respond militarily, and 4 times various people in his administration have tried to walk it back. A little bit less the last time, I would say. The Chinese assume we would go in. I mean, all of their plans are based on the assumption that we go in. I believe the Chinese are probably right. I can say, because I'm involved in it still, even though I left the government, I have all my clearances, I still do exercises. We plan for all eventualities, all the time. The problems we have, though, are that we have allowed some of the strength we would need to do it effectively to erode somewhat in recent years. I'll come back to that. So, sorry, just a second. Missing page here. There we go. There we go. Pages got out of order. Here we go. So the way, I mean, how would we respond? I mean, response can take a lot of forms. Part of it is non-military and things that we are already planning for. It would include a major financial freeze on China and trade freeze. We're already, I mean, that's something we're already discussing with allies, and discussing it in a rather public way so that the Chinese get the word on what would happen. We are also we also look very carefully at how would we deal with a blockade? Well, if you deal with a blockade, you don't necessarily only deal directly with it. You might have to do a counter blockade somewhere. The military always say you don't let the adversary define the battlefield. We would also look carefully at ways in which we might, the ultimate response might be that we would have to counterattack the areas that from which China was actually launching its missiles. That, of course, would be a major step. We have been, one of the things I should say is that the possible involvement of allies has become a more real issue. Japanese have started to speak up quite seriously about how an attack against Taiwan would be viewed as an attack against Japan as well. They never used to say that before. The late Prime Minister Abe was one of the first people to sort of make that point. They're very close. The most southern islands of the Ryukyus in Japan are really close to the most northern islands of Taiwan. I mean, they can see each other. They're that close. The Japanese are starting to stockpile on some of those islands, which is interesting. We're beginning to have talks with the Japanese about how we would coordinate a reaction. That's something, I can say because it's leaked out press, something that didn't happen before. The Philippines, under the new government there, has also started to openly talk about helping if there was a Taiwan emergency, something the previous Philippine governments didn't talk about. Korea, we can't really count on. We can get back to that if anyone's interested. So, meanwhile, in the US, in discussions I've been part of a lot, there's a lot of talk about what we need to do to get our own military preparedness. A lot of that has to do with improving our military production. The Ukraine emergency has taught us a lot, as I said, but it also, among other things, has taught us the inadequacy of our military production and that of our allies. We've kind of run out of a lot of the weapons we've been providing to Ukraine, and it has actually slowed down the speed by which we can send weapons and supplies to Taiwan. So we're working on that, and we're working on helping Taiwan's production. We're working with European allies and Japan and Korea to do combined production. But that's still, to some extent, a work in progress. Meanwhile, our naval strength is not what it used to be. We have great plans for improving it. Those are real. Unfortunately, some of them won't take effect until the 2030s. There's a bit of a gap period that people are worried about, particularly from 2024 to 2027. We need to make our forces more resilient, more mobile. We may need to have them located at more locations, so forth. Although we need to be ready to respond with cyber attacks as well as military attacks. We know that people are working on it, but it's going to require a lot of bipartisan support. And fortunately, their support is there in the Congress. I think we're probably okay. The other thing I would say is that I've talked a lot about military preparedness, military response. Part of deterrence also has a soft side, which is assurance. And we need to, during the meeting with Xi Jinping, President Biden repeated the American position that we do not support independence for Taiwan, meaning severing all claims of being part of a China, Republic of China. That was an important statement. We've said it before. The Taiwanese government, the current government, doesn't really like us saying that, but that's an assurance to China. I would say also it's important, sometimes there are statements, sloppy statements made by people who are in our government. Sometimes there are very radical statements made by people who are out of the government, but in Congress. It would be good to keep the volume down on those sort of gratuitously provocative remarks that get Beijing riled up. They don't accomplish anything. We should focus on doing substantial things that increase our strength, increase Taiwan's strength and resilience, like maybe a trade agreement, a serious trade agreement. We are negotiating one, but for this administration, it's tough to negotiate trade agreements. So that'd do a lot more than all those kinds of statements. So I'm probably gone on too long, but I'll stop there and open it to all your questions. I should say also, as I do whenever I do these talks, if you have questions at some point later on about issues, Asian issues that are not Taiwan, I've do a lot on Southeast Asia and Korea. I was just in Korea. I was just in Vietnam. So we can talk about those issues too if somebody wants to raise them. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Ray. I'm just going to go over the instructions on how to raise your hand for the Q&A one more time. If you're joining us by video today, if you take your mouse and hover over the screen, there is a menu that will pop up on the bottom. You can click on that reactions option and then a raise your hand button. And that will put you in the queue for questions. If you are joining by phone, you can dial *9. That will put you in the queue. I will unmute you when it is time for your question, and then you can hit *9 to take yourself back out. So at any time you guys are ready, go ahead and raise your questions. Our first is Richard has a question.
Can you hear me okay, Ray?
I can, yes.
You had mentioned territorial waters sort of in passing, and I had a question about what the territorial water policy is for both China's and also how that applies to airspace.
Yeah, territorial, I may not get this precisely right, but territorial waters are generally considered to be only, I think it's only 20 miles from your shoreline. And then beyond that, there is something called your exclusive economic zone, which means that people can't fish in there, they can't do seabed mining in there or anything like that without your permission. But they're not territorial waters, and people can cruise through there if they want. China, as in so many things, has taken a very expansive view on this subject, and has very recently has been quite insistent on saying that that the Taiwan Strait is completely under their control, and no one can pass through there without their permission. And they base that, of course, on the fact that they consider Taiwan to be part of their country. Although even under those circumstances, it wouldn't be true, because Taiwan Strait's 100 miles wide. And there are very specific international rules about warships passing through straits and so forth, which I won't bore you with all the International Court of Justice decisions of 1924 and so forth, but they're pretty clear. They're pretty clear about it, and so we've just ignored that. You know, we continue to send our ships through the Taiwan Strait. Even more interestingly, so have other countries like the UK and France, and astonishingly Germany even. So that's more or less the answer on that. Then there are, as far as airspace, I'm not quite as knowledgeable about that, but there are what are called air identification zones, in which you're supposed to, if you fly a commercial flight or a private plane into that area, or a military plane for that matter, you're supposed to announce yourself and so forth. And China and mainland China and Taiwan actually have exclusive air identification zones that overlap each other, which is very confusing. And the Chinese repeatedly fly military planes into Taiwan's air zone. And the Taiwanese respond, and they send up planes, and we all hope, everyone hopes that they don't bump into each other someday and have an accident, which is totally possible. We all remember that has happened in the past, famously between US and Chinese planes over Hainan Island. And back in 2001. So it hasn't happened yet, but it's a worrisome situation.
Ray, before we get on to the next raised hand, we have a question in the channel chat. It says, please explain how China sees Taiwan as a national interest objective. Why is it so important to achieve? Is it cultural or strategic? And if you had to choose, which would be more important?
Yeah, good question. And I'm inclined to give a wise ass New York answer and say that it's a form of derangement of the Chinese, but it is, and at times it does actually take on that kind of characteristic. I would say that part of it is that it has been whipped up as a extremely important nationalistic goal for 70 years, with ever greater sort of frenzy. Frenzy may be an overstatement, but ever greater enthusiasm and intent. And so in China, they talk about their netizens, which means all the citizens who are on the internet. And the netizens are very vocal and very nationalistic. And that includes the young ones too. And one of the subjects is Taiwan. And if some company, this happens all the time, some company uses a map in its advertising and doesn't show Taiwan as part of China, or it lists, or if Marriott lists all its hotels and it doesn't list the ones in Taiwan as part of China, the netizens go into a frenzy, and they launch boycotts and everything. And so all of this is, the government's creation, all of this, but the government, now it's become something that's in some ways actually a pressure point on the government. They have to, if you're a leader in China, you have to keep the netizens happy with all this nationalist fervor. So that's part of it. And it's part of this whole narrative of the 100 years of humiliation and overcoming that by making China strong, rejuvenating China, and reunifying the whole of China. And that included, of course, getting back Hong Kong in 1997 and getting back Macau in 1999. And so the last piece of that is Taiwan. And as far as the strategic value, it's also important. Military people talk about, this goes way back to Admiral Mahan in the era of Teddy Roosevelt, talk about the first island chain, but it's still an active concept of strategy, geostrategic strategy. The first island chain goes from Japan and the Ryukyus down through Taiwan, and then through the little islands in between Taiwan and the Philippines and down through the Philippines. And the first island chain encloses mainland China. It means that to move cargo, to move their navy, they have to go through the various straits and narrow waters that are between all of these other countries and Taiwan. And so achieving that would be a strategic gain for Taiwan. And it would mean also that they would be able to block other countries in a way that they can't do now. So that's also an important issue. And it is important to us as well. We generally do not tend to talk about our Taiwan commitment in strategic terms. We generally talk about it in terms of supporting this democracy, in being important to our credibility and all that. But there's no question that there is a strategic aspect also, at least indirectly. The Japanese are quite clear about it. The Japanese, who are our closest allies in Asia, are always very, very clear that the loss of Taiwan to become part of the People's Republic of China would be a strategic threat to them. It'd be right there, right next to them, right below them, right south of them. And they do not see Beijing as a friend. They see it as very definitely an adversary. They have this rather scary constant quarrel that goes on over some islands controlled by Japan that China thinks that China keeps buzzing all the time, daily. So that is a strategic aspect that is, at a minimum, I would say, an indirect one because of our relationship with China. I mean, with Japan.
Thank you, Ray. Jenny Beer, I'm gonna have you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Perfect timing, because I actually had a question about Japan. Nicely. I was really surprised that the Japanese and Americans have not coordinated in thinking about a potential Chinese attack on Taiwan. That's really astonishing to me. Is this because of historical reasons and internal political reasons that Japan can't be seen as attacking an Asian neighbor? Is this why it's quiet?
Yeah. Very good question.
Let me just add to that. If you want to say a few words about why South Korea is not playing along, I'd love to hear about that too.
Yeah, very good questions. For those of us who I'm not a Japan expert. I've never lived there and worked there, but I've been there many times. And my oldest daughter married a Japanese and lives there. So now I'm learning about Japan from a very non-professional way. The Second World War had a big effect on Japan. And Japan the US, forced Japan to adopt a constitution, which it was prepared to adopt in 1948, in which it gave up the idea of having an armed force and gave up having ever using military action against except in self-defense, very narrowly defined self-defense. And it's gotten around not having a military force by having a military force that it calls the Special Defense Force. In fact, the Japanese have quite an impressive military force, particularly a very impressive Navy, and one of the world's best. And they've sort of inched away from the commitment to never use force in various ways over the years, particularly under Abe. And they've sort of broadened the circumstances under which they could respond to the threats, and broadened the definition of what would be a threat. So that's partially, that's sort of the answer to your question there. But it's still under the Constitution, there would have to be a vote in the Diet, which is their parliament, to agree to actually use force. And it's never going to be 100% clear how that would come out, because to maintain a majority, the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, which for almost the entire post-war period has controlled the government, has had to have an alliance with a rather pacifist Buddhist party. So their votes can never be sure. This is more detail than you wanted, I think, but that it explains, why their hands are somewhat tied. So the real surprise is how far they've been willing to lean in what we consider the more assertive direction, and they have. And some of my friends who were in the Trump government, who were dealing with Japan on this issue, said, Ray, they said the Japanese were more ready to talk about joint war plans than we were, so which is really amazing. So now in the case of Korea, we have going back to Japan, because the US forces that are based in Korea are explicitly defined as being there to defend Korea, as being there, and that's public. They're defined that they are there in the event of a Korean emergency, and that's why there isn't much army there. It's all Air Force and Navy, because the army's there in Korea already. There's zero Navy in Korea, but there is some Air Force of US forces. Korea, which I spent 3.5 years in Korea, so I know Korea, and I was just there in September. The Koreans have always recoiled at the idea that US forces based in Korea would be used for anything else except the defense of Korea. And they've also have very strong economic relationship with China, which is important to them. It's their major trading partner. Now, in the last few years, the Chinese have succeeded in infuriating the Koreans by taking sanctions against the Koreans for putting in anti-missile defenses to be used against the North Korea, but which the Chinese claimed could be used against them, so they didn't like it. And so that infuriated, it was a foolish move by the Chinese, which really infuriated the Koreans. And the current government in Korea also has been quite wary about the Chinese. And but my hunch is they would look the other way if we needed to use some of our forces in Korea, which we probably won't. That would be a pretty bad situation we'd be in if we had to do that. But we might need some of the Air Force people. We might need some of the Air Force, some of the facilities at the Air Force, like the medical facility or something. But the idea that Korean troops would get involved is, I think, close to zero.
Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
All right, the next question, the person in line here is Ray Ott. I'm going to have you unmute yourself, Ray, and ask your question.
Yes, CETO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. What was it? How did it fail, or why did it fail? And what was its relationship with Taiwan?
Yeah, interesting question. CETO, of course, no longer exists. CETO was you're challenging. CETO even predates my time. CETO was called on during the Vietnam War years, and I guess was one of the reasons why Thailand had forces in Vietnam during the war. It was an alliance against communist forces that might challenge the autonomy or the non-communist status of the countries in Southeast Asia. There were, I mean, people have all forgotten, but there was a communist insurgency in Malaysia that was fairly serious that the British largely put down. There was an insurgency in Thailand for a while. And then, of course, there was Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And with the end of the Vietnam War, CETO really disappeared. And you also had the growth of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which was an exclusively Southeast Asian organization, but in which the US and China and other countries were brought in as dialogue partners, which just happened last week, as a matter of fact, in Cambodia. And President Biden was there for that reason. So how was Taiwan involved? I honestly don't remember exactly how it was involved, but it was a Southeast Asian organization. Taiwan was never considered and isn't really part of Southeast Asia. So the Taiwanese did not get involved in the Vietnam War, though. And part of it was they had enough to worry about. And we wanted to sort of keep them focused on their own defense. I'm sorry, I haven't given you too good an answer, but CETO is not, it's an interesting historical question, but it's not currently in our minds that much. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you. I was just curious as to how, if there were ever, if Taiwan was ever involved with it.
No, not part of CETO. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Ray. All right, I currently don't have anyone else in the queue. If somebody has a question, feel free to raise your hand, or you can even add to the meeting chat. I will read the question aloud.
I've got a question. So, Ambassador, the headquarters for the world's semiconductor industry is in Taiwan. You mentioned Taiwan Semiconductor.
Yes.
There are several others like United Microelectronics,
Yep.
etc. And by many, they consider, by many pundits, they consider this perhaps an existential choke point for that industry and thus for the world, because much of our life is controlled in the developed world by semiconductors. Do you think that China would go so far as to destroy, in their quest to reunite, they can't do it peacefully, to do it militarily, but as sort of collateral damage, destroy the semiconductor industry, which would, some would say, put the world into an economic depression and include China, because China depends a great deal on the semiconductors that come out of Taiwan?
Very important questions, which we talk about a lot and are very much in the news even as we speak today. The Taiwan, they sometimes talk about the semiconductor industry there being their silicon shield, because destroying it would be such a disaster for the world. I know some of what I know about this subject comes from having attended a very, very useful conference last year at Stanford at the Hoover Institute, and which was just focused on this on the semiconductor industry. And there were people there besides all the usual foreign policy and military experts. There were leading people from Qualcomm and from TSMC and Samsung and the semiconductor manufacturing industry of the US and so forth. And what I learned and what I've continued to follow is that while Taiwan is the TSMC in Taiwan really has a lock on the most advanced form of semiconductors, the ones that are called the cutting edge ones. But a lot of the ones that are used in cars and cell phones and refrigerators and everything else are what are called legacy semiconductors, which are less sophisticated ones, which are made in the United States, made in China, some are made in Taiwan as well, and a lot are made in Korea. And Samsung, by the way, is also a competing manufacturer of cutting edge semiconductors, although nowhere near as large a producer as TSMC, not yet anyway. One of the interesting, it is, the question of what do you do with the semiconductor industry in Taiwan if conflict seems imminent? And this is a question that gets a lot of discussion. One of the wise comments that Morris Zhang, the founder of TSMC, has made over the years is that the most important thing in my fabs, the fabs are these multi-billion-dollar factories that make semiconductors. The most important thing in those fabs is what is between the ears of the engineers. That they can't operate without those engineers. So there's discussion about, would you move them out of Taiwan? Have them ready to set up somewhere else if things looked endangered? It's a possibility. Now, one of the other things that's going on, of course, is that we're building a semiconductor TSMC is building a semiconductor fab in Arizona. It's just been reported in Taiwan that their TSMC is now looking at building at the same time another equally sized fab just down the road from the one it's now building in Arizona. New ones are coming online and are being planned for Japan, for Korea, for all over the place, Europe. This causes some mixed feelings in Taiwan. Great that its companies are going to control this manufacturing in the US, Japan, all those places. On the other, but then there are people in Taiwan that say, this is going to hollow out the industry in Taiwan. This is a hedge, an insurance that the world's taking in case Taiwan gets overrun. But is that going to make us expendable? So, all of these issues are up in the air, and there are no clean answers to them. Because people are going to take out insurance policies, and the world is going to take out insurance policies on ensuring its semiconductor production. Because we, can't be 100% sure how deterrence is going to work. That's not a clean answer, but I think I've just described what people are doing and how people are thinking about it. Any follow up on that?
No, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. I know it's a complicated issue. Chrissy, are there any other questions?
Nope, I think we are good.
Okay, great. Well, Ambassador, thank you very much for your time and all your counsel. We appreciate it. And to you all, thank you very much for attending. We'll be doing this again in the coming months. We wish you all a happy Thanksgiving if we don't talk to you before the end of the year. Have a happy holiday. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoy the discussion. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Very informative.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ray.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you,
Richard, you
Ray.
still on?
I'm still on. Thank you, sir.
So, is that okay?
Oh, great job. Great job. Wonderful, wonderful hour. And I don't think a soul left. So that's a pretty good tribute.
I expected more. I expected more questions, but that's all right. Yeah. So,
Our client, Nick Hammersley, wants to pass along what his friend Admiral Denny Blair had to say. Nick, are you unmuted?
I think I am. Can you hear me? Let's see.
Yes, we can.
Oh,
yeah, I
okay.
can hear you. I can hear you.
Yes, I was amazed to get a nice note from Dennis sending his regards and speaking very highly and fondly of you.
Oh, yeah. Now he's great. I mean, I knew him in two roles, and I may be getting my scenario, my timeline a little wrong, but I very vividly remember him visiting Vietnam while I was ambassador there, and particularly vividly remember that he and I went together to meet with the great General Giap, the hero of Dien Bien Phu, and the guy who was their leader and who was like 90-something years old at the time, but very coherent. We had a wonderful meeting with General Giap in his home, and I also went with Denny Blair. We flew in a rather worrisome Soviet-era helicopter to a site on the northern shore of Taiwan and the Red River Delta area, where there was this huge crew of people excavating the remains of an American plane and pilot that had crashed into the beach and was buried under there. And yeah, that was also an interesting day. There were some people that we got some unfriendly words from some of the people there, which I had to translate for Denny, which was, basically like, if I were you guys, I wouldn't come back here. It might not be safe the second time, I mean, really. So
Comforting.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, it was about the only time I ever got that kind of reaction from people about the Vietnam War, which was interesting. But it was probably, as Admiral Blair commented when I did the translation, he said, that pilot may have dropped a bomb that killed that guy's daughter. Who knows? So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Ray, I want to share one comment from one of our clients. When we sent around your bio, it says that you speak Vietnamese, Mandarin Chinese, and Spanish. And the client asked, I hope he speaks English also.
Yeah, you told me that. Yeah, I told me that. I know. Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it may occasionally lapse into New Yorkese, but it's
Still English, that's right.
It's less New Yorkese than it used to be. So, yeah. My secretary here when at the East West Center, who worked for me before I left there in 2012, he used to say that whenever I got back from spending a few days in New York, she said, for about the first 36 hours, you sound like Ralph Cramden. I said, thanks a lot. That's really.
You realize half the people in the universe don't know who Ralph Cramden is.
I know. I knew that you would. Yes, right.
Julie, say
right,
hello.
well.
Yes, I'm here and I say hello.
Julie, great to see you. Hello.
Good to see you too. Nice. I loved all that you did. It was really enlightening. It was very good. Very.
Yeah, I got my handwritten notes a little confused there toward the end, but that's all right. Sorry about that. Yeah. So yeah.
We still have some. We have about a third of the people still listening. So.
Really?
Yes,
Okay.
There's still people here. So.
Well, they can still fire off a question if they want. Usually these things, people ask more questions about South China Sea and all that kind of stuff, but. Maybe that issue. We already lost that battle, so maybe that issue kind of we did really, be honest about it. So,
well,
yeah.
many thanks for stepping in and.
Right. All right.
Best
next time you're on the East
Caroline and
Coast.
Helen and family.
I don't have any urgent tax questions for you. I don't think. So,
There we go. Next time you're on the East Coast, whether New York or Washington, stop by in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and we'll have
I'd
a
like
couple-
to do that. Yeah, I mean, I often take the train between New York and Washington, so I could always stop in Philadelphia. So
Or
yeah,
you can,
There
or
you
you
go.
get off at Wilmington. We'll come meet you there and pick you up.
that's even closer.
Yep. Yep.
Oh,
It's
okay, that's
easier to
interesting.
get to than Philly. Yep.
I could go visit our friend in Newark also.
That's true. That's true. Good point.
That's right.
Actually, when I was in Washington last month, he came to Washington to meet with me. He normally comes to Cape Cod, but he couldn't figure it out when to do it, and he was going to come here to Hawaii at some point in December, but I'm not going to be here. So he suggested Washington, and I said, yeah, there is a date that would work, and so we met in Washington.
That's great. Didn't you say you saw him at the British Embassy or something?
No, I met with him. We had our own meeting at the University Club in Washington over lunch. But also separate from that, and about a week earlier, I met him at Taiwan's National Day party, which was on the 10th no, in fact, it's supposed to be on the 10th, but they had it on like the 7th or the 8th of October. And it's a big, huge party. And they have it in the former residence of Alexander Graham Bell, which is called Twin Oaks. It's on about, I don't know, 15 acres, magnificent place. And which they held on to through the machinations of Barry Goldberg and other Republicans and Hugh Scott after 1979. And so that's where I ran into, as I walked in there, sort of close to the receiving line, I knew he was going to be there, but I didn't think I'd find him so easily. There was Paul. It was like, it was kind of stunning.
That's great. That's a great story.
And so I think it was then, yes, it was then and there that we agreed on the date to meet like a week or 10 days later in Washington. So yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah. All right.
I did
Thank
put
you.
everything in the meeting chat if anybody else had any further questions that they could email us and I'd forward them on to you, Ray.
All right. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you,
Bye.
Christina. All right,
Yep.
bye, Ray.
All right,
Bye.
thanks, everybody. Bye.
All right.
Leaving.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Chrissy.
Mhm.